first reading this morning is from Acts chapter 17. Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." The word of the Lord.
So a couple weeks ago, Pastor Christine was here for Lexi's baptism, and after the service was over and most people had left, the two of us had a chance to catch up for a little bit and talk about a few things, and we agreed that we needed to get together and talk some more about all kinds of things. But I said to her, there's a few things that I would really like in terms of church to pick your brain about, because there are areas that you really know a lot about, and there are certain things that are just not working as well as they have. The context has changed, and I know we need to adapt them. I'm just not sure how. And I mentioned a couple of things in particular that I wanted to talk to her about. And at that point, Pastor Christine told me something that they're doing at the church that she and Maddie are going to right now. And she prefaced it by saying, I have always been opposed to this. But now after COVID, I think we need to reconsider that, or at least something like it. And as she told me that, I thought, whether I say those words or not, so many of the things that I have done in the past couple of years have begun with my thinking those same words. I would never do this. I'm really opposed to this. I don't want to do this, but now the context has changed. And, it's sometimes the case that it's not so much that it was COVID as much as COVID accelerated a lot of trends, and it forced me to think, boy, this is a different context, and I have to think differently. Broadcasting worship, as we're doing right now, is one of those examples. If you had told me 5 years ago, you're going to be streaming worship online, I'd have gone, no, I'm not doing that. Because, first of all, I grew up in an age when there were TV preachers, and all of them had terrible theology, and mostly were wannabe celebrities. And that just didn't strike me as church. But more importantly, I knew people who that was their only connection to church. They watched TV church. But they didn't have any connection to community. They didn't know anybody that they were worshiping with, and I thought, I never want to encourage that. But then COVID happened, and suddenly we had to adapt. And yet, as we did that, I started to realize that we were now making regular worship experiences possible for people who were sick, for people who were shut in. We kept people connected to our congregation who were away or on travel, which is a lot lately. And we made it possible for people who live very far away to be able to participate virtually for weddings, for baptisms, for funerals. None of that would have been possible before. And when I look at the view counts, because even though I despise TV preachers and I still look at the view counts every week, I realize that there's a lot of people out there who still need us to do this. And so even though I would have begun this with, I have always been opposed to this, I now realize that after COVID, the context has changed, and things like streaming worship really need to be one of the ways that we adapt to a new situation. And that is actually what Paul is doing in today's first reading. It was not quite as, maybe traumatic and sudden as a pandemic, but Paul also had suddenly been thrust into a new context that he was probably not expecting. Paul and his companions had been traveling through northern Greece, and Paul had been doing what he had always done even before he came to Greece. He had found a community of Jews. He found the synagogue, and on the Sabbath he would go in and do what people did. They would read the scriptures, and then he would debate, and he would try to prove from the scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. He did that where he lived. He did that in Greece. But unsurprisingly, as he did this in town to town, he ticked people off. And so they kicked him out of one of the towns he was in, and they threatened to kill him. So he went to another town, and he did the same thing, and he ticked those people off. So he kicked him out of there, and finally his buddies said to him, "We need to take you someplace and just cool down for a little bit, and let things cool down, and then when it's safe, we'll start again." So they sent him to Athens. Athens is one of these places which is great to read about in the Bible because it's one of the few places you probably know where it is and you've heard of it. But it was a sleepy little town in college town, kind of in Paul's day. Not many people were there. There was a synagogue and there were Jews, but it was not a place that Paul was expecting to go. And as far as we can tell, he never went there again after today's reading. But while he was there, he's walking around in this mostly pagan city. And people have found out about him, so they drag him up to the Areopagus, which is this big open-air courtyard. And because Athens is mostly a place with philosophy schools, it's where they debate all of these ideas and philosophies and new teachings and things. And they say, "Hey, listen, you're spreading some new teaching. We want you to tell us about this. Come up here and do this." Suddenly, he's got an entirely different context. He's got to explain Jesus to a group of pagans who have no idea what a Messiah is. They have never read, probably any of them, nor care what we call the Old Testament is. So he's got no basis for starting anything. So he's got two choices. He can either adapt to the new context and try to do it, or he can say, no, we don't do online worship. Come to the synagogue on Saturday, and then I'll try to explain it to you somehow, or doing it the way we usually do it. So what he does is he starts with what they know. He starts to talk to them about how it is that God is, based on their own understandings of kind of pagan philosophers and poets. These quotes that were in the first reading today are all Stoic and other kinds of philosophy that people would have known about. And then he starts to talk about Jesus not as Messiah, which is this Jewish term. He starts to talk about Jesus being raised from the dead. He talks about the resurrection. He does that partly because it's the main point, but also because the resurrection itself is or creates a new context. If you're living your life in a way that understands that God has raised Jesus from the dead, that your death is not the end of you, then you are living in a new world and in a new context. Paul understands that he's already living in a new context because of the resurrection of Jesus, and that's where he starts when he lives into this new one. So, honestly, living into a new context is not something new. It's something Christians have always been called to do because of the resurrection of Jesus. And we too are living into a new context. And it's not just because of COVID, although, as I said, COVID did accelerate a bunch of changes and a bunch of trends that were there before. Instead, in every new age and in every place, the resurrection of Jesus means God is bringing us into new life right now. And it means living into new contexts and into new life situations. And adapting to those new contexts can be really hard. Like Paul and like us during COVID, it's hard because we're not always expecting the shift in context. Adapting can be hard because we're not really sure what we need to do in order to adapt. And sometimes, for me at least, and I've lived through this in the last few years, maybe you have too, adapting is hard because deep down I want to tell myself, maybe the need to adapt will pass and I can go back to the way things were. Doesn't work that way. The resurrection, though, means that like Paul, we are always being called to adapt to a new and a different context. So we're actually going to try to work on adapting to a new context this summer at Prince of Peace. And that includes reimagining yard sale. Now, if you just come to yard sale this year, you might not see a lot of differences in yard sale, but we have really been trying this year to adapt what yard sale is really supposed to be about. For years, we've talked about how yard sale is about serving the community. It's about recycling and reusing. It's about building community within the congregation. And I remember years ago, as we would get ready for yard sale, Scott Gowing, a lot of folks will remember, he would stand up here and he had these great stories about how we had helped people at yard sale. He talked about a story one time where he said, literally people came up and hugged us and said, I could not afford to buy clothing for my children for school unless I had this yard sale with these children's clothes. And we had these stories every year, and he would tell these stories, and everyone would listen to those stories and they would smile sweetly and go, oh, this is great. And we loved how we were helping people and smile. But every year, as soon as yard sale was over, like within hours of yard sale being over, people would be walking up to me, and what they would ask me all the time is, what's the count? How much money we make? How much money we make? And because they bugged me so much, I thought, I got to just, because we never know until, months later after people pay their yard sale tax. But I said, fine, okay, here's what the counters told me. We raised this much money. And whatever I said, that was the line that got thunderous applause from everybody. And I thought, I was always a little uncomfortable with that because I thought what gets thunderous applause is often the thing that really matters. And it's true that in the old context of yard sale, the money really was the point. It started, some of you remember this, but I mean, before me, yard sale was begun because we had a mortgage back then, which thankfully we do not now, but we literally were not paying the mortgage. And so yard sale was an attempt to raise enough money that we could at least make some basic payments on the mortgage. And so no matter what we all said and all the other things we saw that it was doing for good, it was necessary to have this massive event and to kill ourselves to try to make every extra possible buck we could. But that is not the context anymore. And sometimes, even when it's not been the context, it's hard to move out of that context. So this year we're trying to adapt by only staffing departments if people feel like working them. If not, we won't have it, and we won't sell that stuff. We're going to go through yard sale, and we're going to take out stuff before the sale starts to help a refugee family furnish their apartment, even if they're things that could bring in high dollar amounts for us, because that's the point. It's not, thank you, we're getting applause lines for that. It's not about the money. And we have no goals for how much money we're going to raise. It's not about we got to be solvent unless we raise every possible buck. It's a step to adapting yard sale to a new context. We'll do the same thing with Vacation Bible School. From the beginning, VBS here and in other churches was always focused on really trying to help kids grow in faith, learn Bible stories, and dig more deeply into those stories because it was a longer, more intensive event. But over the years, the context in which that has happened has changed. Many more of our kids cannot attend a daytime event anymore. Fewer adults are available to lead. And while years ago we felt that we were reaching a lot of kids who were unchurched or didn't have any other opportunity for Christian education, that has rarely been the case anymore. I mean, we always knew that there were going to be a few kids that were going to show up just because it was good, daytime daycare. But we felt like, okay, there were a bunch of people who were really didn't have churches, really weren't getting any kind of education at all. But those folks started to decrease a lot. And I remember I was back here in the narthex. It was Thursday night. We always did this big parent thing. The kids would sing songs, and we would do this thing to show the parents what we were doing in Vacation Bible School. It was packed the house, and it was lots of fun. And one parent who was not a member of the congregation came up to me, knew I was the pastor, and she says, "Oh, we love how you guys do Vacation Bible School. You do the best, most creative way of teaching these stories we have ever. This is so great what you do. It's so great." And I said, "Well, thank you. It's great. But, full disclosure, we have, I think we were using Group. We use a canned program. We just put it together. We do what they tell us. And she says to me, oh, yeah, I know, because my kids have been to 3 of these already this summer. But you do it better than everybody else. And she's true. She's right. We do it better than everybody else. But I thought, your kids have been to this same story and these same lessons 4 different times. We're not really doing anything other than providing you another, daycare opportunity. And more it became like that. So part of adapting to the new context is to still do VBS, but put it in the evening when more kids who want and need Christian education can be here. It's going to include dinner so that we can actually have time to grow together as a community, and it'll include an adult class, which I'll teach, and we're going to do the same stories. Sometimes we've talked about, sounds like I'm going to do something different over here, but we're going to look at the same stories that the kids are looking at, but we're going to look at them as an adult study. And we're going to do that because one of the things that we surveyed at the annual meeting was adults were saying, hey, we need to do some adult ed in the evenings as well. So this is going to be an opportunity to help all of us to grow and actually do Christian ed and adapt to this new context. It's still doing what's important, but it's doing it in a different way, just as Paul was telling the same story about Jesus, but adapting it to a different context. Adapting, it can still be hard, and we will make mistakes in it, and it takes time. It did for Paul and for the first disciples of Jesus as well. But they kept at it, and so should we, because the resurrection of Jesus has already brought us into a new and different context, in which Jesus is still leading us, even now, into a new and different life.